Hello, this is Danny from CG Dreams. In this video series we're going to be looking at how to create this bumblebee, first by modelling it, then moving on to rigging it. I'm going to be taking you step by step through this process, and I would say that this is more ideal for a beginner who has some experience in other 3D packages, or more intermediate for people that are a bit more experienced. In this first set of videos is going to be all about modelling, and then the next set of videos is going to be about rigging this bee. First we start with creating a primitive, and we'll make the primitive small enough so we can start working on it. We can scale the whole bee up later on. We make it editable, and then we can just start to work on this at a very low polygon level. I'm going to use the quick extrude, which is the control key, and then I'm using the T key to change to the scale. And you'll be seeing me do this fast extrude quite a bit using the control key. I now add in a cloner. I'm going to put this inside the cloner. We're going to clone this a few times in a linear setting. And we're going to go for the count of 6. I'm going to adjust the scale on the X and the Z axis so that it scales down smaller as it goes towards the back. Making some adjustments as to how far these are apart. I'm now going to apply the cloner to a subdivisional surface. I'm going to adjust the Z-axis for the cloner so that they're nicely sitting inside each other, but with a little tiny gap so they're not completely touching. I'm now going to apply this permanently, making it editable so that I've got all of these parts, and removing all these parts out from the subdivisional surface locator and adding an FDD deformer. We're going to put all of the parts into a connect object and then put the FDD deformer into the connect, and this way it's going to treat it as one object. Increasing the spans of the FDD deformer allows me to get more control over what I'm going to be doing next. So I'm going to select the rectangle tool with the points mode, and I'm going to start manipulating this with the scale tool, the T key. We're actually manipulating the points of the deformer. I'm using the shortcut keys, the T key and then the 0 key, to keep on switching backwards and forwards between the selection tool and the scale tool. I'm going to select all of these and select current state to object, and then I'm going to delete everything inside here. We no longer need this. We've already got this all done there, so we can delete this, and now we've got a new shape, which is going to be the abdomen. We can double click on these in the polygon mode to make sure that they're all remaining separate. If, like me, you find that there's some problems there where it's welded some areas, we can loop select and delete the bad polygons, and then we can just extrude and fix that problem. afterwards. So the control key for the fast extrude, and using the move tool and the scale tool to keep on fast extruding. Now I'm selecting all of the points, and I'm going to go to the weld points tool, and then just click anywhere on the screen and it will weld those endpoints into one single point at the end. It's always a good idea to name everything as you go along. We're now going to start to look at making the thorax by using a primitive sphere. My aim is to keep everything as simple as possible. At certain points I will be speeding things up where there's a repetitive part, but you won't be missing anything. I'm using basic tools here, just scale and the move tools, and I also make good use of the deformers. So I'm going to select the FDD deformer, fit to parent, and then I'm going to start to increase some spans on the FDD deformer and then start to do the manipulation as before with the scale tool, switching between the scale tool, the T key, and 0, the selection tool. Selecting an object and control and dragging it will make a duplicate of it. I've done this for the thorax so that I'm going to be using the same object for the head. Again, I'm keeping things relatively simple for a beginner, but we're going to make it more advanced a little bit later on. As you can see, I'm using very basic shapes to start with. I could have used a hexahedron type sphere, but this will do for now. And it also gives me the opportunity to show you some tools of how to fix poles later on. I'm labelling the soft selection and just changing the radius so that I can do some manipulation with the scale tool. You can do exactly the same with polygons, using the live selection tool to select those polygons, and then I'm just going to manipulate with that soft selection on. Again, these are all useful tools to use, like soft selection and the deformers for modelling purposes. Now I'm going to go ahead and select the loop slice tool, create a couple more loop slices in there. The UI will grow the selection and the UK key combination will shrink the selection. Next we're going to create the eye sockets for the eyes by selecting some polygons that are close in proximity to the area that we want. Turn off soft selection if it's still on. We're going to select the iron tool so that we can smooth that selection down a little bit. And then we're going to select the polygon pen and we're going to manipulate some of these points so they're more fitting the shape of the eye. What we're doing here is we're preparing the area for an extrusion. Using the control key for the fast extrusion in combination with the scale, I'm making a series of extrusions. If you right click on the tool handle, you can change it to normal so that it's actually facing the tool handle in the normal direction. This way I can move and extrude in the correct orientation. I'll put it in a subdivisional surface, and then I'm going to apply permanently, making it editable at level 1. Back in polygon mode again, I'm going to loop select U and L, half of the head, and continue to make sure that I've got the loop selected, and then delete, and then I can double click on the polygons to delete the rest. It's important that the access point for the object is right at the weld center space when you're using symmetry in a moment. A quick way of doing this is to create a null and put the object inside a null, but this object's going to be fine, so I've added the symmetry object, clamp the points and delete on the axis, and then apply that permanently. Each time a null gets made, I'm going to delete it so it's not in the scene, and then appropriately rename the object. Going back to the back of the head, I'm continually manipulating and extruding to get what I want from this. Holding down the control key and clicking on the points will convert those the edge selection to points. Then I can use the weld to weld those points. I'm now selecting some more points, and then I'm using the scale on those four corners so I can then start to do some fast extruding. U and Y will expand the selection, and then using this iron tool will make it nice and smooth. So selecting the thorax area that we've created, doing a series of extrusions with exactly the same tools. Loop slice to create tighter creases. This particular part wasn't really necessary, but thinking in terms of 3D printing, this is something that I would definitely do to create some sockets. Now, to create an area flat, we can use the scale tool. It's going to create a nice surface that's nice and flat for us. If you hold down the shift key, what it will do while you're simultaneously scaling it is it will enable you to lock it down to percentage. You can see here 0%, it's going to make it completely flat. I'm doing exactly the same for the inside, and it's one way of making something really flat rather than having it curvatured in those areas. Looking at anatomy pictures, there's an area on the back of the thorax called the scutum, and I've represented this shape here now. Although I'm not trying to create something 100% anatomically correct, I'm just using it as a rough indication of the form. So I'm selecting those polygons, and then again using the fast extrude the control key, and then in a combination of the move tool and the scale tool for these fast extrusions. If you want tighter creases, you just add more loops closer to the previous edge. Selecting the belly of the thorax, I'm now going to do exactly the same thing. Selecting an area like this and then using soft selection to do some further manipulation, just increasing the radius so that I'm getting the right effect there. What I'm doing is I'm preparing the area for the next lot of extrusions. Removing that soft selection now. And now we're going to look a bit more closer as to the areas in which we're going to create for the holes where the legs are going to fit into the sockets. This just adds a little bit more detail to the model. Again, the commonly used tool, fast extrude. And I'm always working on very low polygon model at this stage because I have in mind that I'm going to be subdividing it later on. You notice that I do a bit of preparation when it comes to creating an area that should be seen as rounded or a certain shape. It's good to spend a bit of time to do this so that your next extrude is going to come out exactly the shape that you want, because it's easier to do it now than it is to try to reshape it after you've done the extrusion. So I'm trying to create a circle as close as I can, using that scale tool to flatten out the area. And now I'm going to start to extrude inwards to create that socket. And you'll notice that I'm doing a couple of extrusions on areas that I want it to be a bit more tighter around the edges. Loop select by double clicking on the edges here to create a slight indentation. I'm thinking ahead what it's going to look like when I apply a subdivisional surface to it. I'm isolating the next part now so that I can really see it by itself. I'm going to go to the orthographic view, the front. I'm going to select half the object to delete it and then apply asymmetry to the object so that I've mirrored it to the other side. So I'm dragging the thorax into there. Again, I'm going to clamp the points to the axis and delete the points on the axis, and then apply that permanently. Would also be a good point to add it to a subdivisional surface as well, if I'm happy with what I've got there. I see a couple of areas that I just want to manipulate a little bit, and now's the time to do it. It's a good time to do this before you start to subdivide. It's easier to work with less polygons at this level. Take the solo view off just to see how it looks with the rest of it, and then gives me an idea of what I've got to do with the next part of the thorax. Flatten this off, maybe create some kind of area that sits between the two. There's no need for me to have those polygons there. And it's looking in good shape now. So I'm going to apply a subdivisional surface. Again at level 1. It's a subdivisional render setting that does this. And then I'm going to make it editable to take us to this stage. And so far it's looking fine. And that would be a good point to stop here and then take a break, and then we can start to work on the legs. For the legs, we're going to be doing something very similar, working with primitive objects, in this particular case a cylinder. Again, I'm going to be keeping this pretty simple using these primitive shapes, and then just do our manipulation to these primitive shapes. I'm going to be creating one segment at a time. Now I'm only going to move this in position just to get the rough scale of this. I'm not actually going to be rotating the legs to the orientation of the socket just yet. I want to make sure that I'm modelling everything straight down in a straight fashion. So this time a hexahedron is the type of primitive sphere that I'm using. It's got no poles. And I'm going to be using this as like a ball joint between each part of the leg, like for the thigh and the shin and the foot. Pretty much everything that you're going to be seeing me do here is using exactly the same tools and methods that I've used so far. Using the soft selection to do some manipulation. I'm improvising a little bit of my own design in this, so it's not going to be 100% anatomical to the real thing. Again, the control and drag select on an object will make a duplicate of it, and it gives me a perfect chance to then create the next section of the leg. I know I'm going to be doing some manipulation to the shape of this, so I'm increasing the spans, adding the taper deformer. I'm going to be applying this so that I can do some further manipulation to get some different shapes in there. You can change the orientation of the alignment so that it's tapering the right end. I'm just going to further tweak it to get the shape that I want. Now I'm going to select both of these, right click and current state to object, and delete that, and I'll be left with the applied deformation that's been created by that taper deformer. I can then start to work on doing some extrusions so that the ball can fit into the socket. Again, I'm going to delete these polygons because we're not going to be seeing them. I'm going to create a slight bevel there. Drag with the control key to duplicate this. Put it into position and then start to manipulate this particular part of the leg. Then delete those polygons. Okay, now I'm going to just create that smoothed edge there with the bevel. I'm separating these parts off, and I'm going to continue to duplicate the parts and manipulate them to get the shape that I want using the tools that I've been using so far. This time I'm going to use the bend deformer. Fit to parent, and then you can start to bend this. Probably don't need as much bend there, just a little bit there, to give it some curvature. Apply that permanently as I've done before, so the deformer is no longer in action. It's been edited down. I'm going to select these polygons to give it a little bit of a different shape. And I'll select the middle edges there just to pull that shape up a little bit. Again, I'm working with just enough polygons to get the initial shape, and then I can choose to subdivide this afterwards. Unless you're going for a really low polygon model, that's not what I'm trying to create here. I'm creating a relatively detailed model that you should be able to go close to without even going as far as applying a subdivisional surface at all. FDD deformer, fit to parent, and then we can start to do some manipulation in there. Exactly the same as before. I'm going to just start to scale out some of these points on the deformer itself. Apply that permanently as I've been doing so far, and just continue this process doing the same thing, and each time I'm done with this, I'm selecting both the taper object and the object itself, right click, and then apply this. You see, it's pretty simple, the shapes are pretty simple. Now I'm going to create like the foot area, and we'll start with a very basic cube with enough spans in it to start to model from. It's always a good idea to start very low polygon, but with enough polygons there for you to work on. Have in mind the shape that you want to create, and then just think to yourself, how close can I get to this shape with this few polygons? Also, when you're modeling, you want to consider as well that you're going to be UV mapping this. So you want nice edge flow on there. Deleting half of it. And then working on the opposite side. Loop slice. This is the area that I want to create these little extra toes. Now I'm using the brush tool here in smear mode to create this shape that I want here. You can use the polygon pen as I've already done so far, but you can use this as well. Get it as round as I can. Got to remember that we're working on an organic object here, so nothing has to be absolutely perfect when it comes to like spherical areas. If it was a hard surface model, it would be a bit different, but with this we can do a bit of guesstimating. A series of extrusions are going to follow now, where I'm going to create these little toes. At least anatomically it's something that you can understand it as toes, but I'm sure that these parts have got different anatomical names to them. I will be closing that end off by converting the polygons to points, and then using the weld tool. You want to make use of this soft selection. It's really nice tool to use. Again, with symmetry applied, and then permanently apply that. And of course there's nothing to stop you from going back later on, changing some things about it. Once you've got the initial geometry there, you can keep on going back and changing things. And that's something that I will do later on. I shall change some things on this later on. Delete those nulls. Apply a subdivisional surface, level 1. Give it a good check before you apply it permanently. And rename appropriately. When you're creating multiple parts like this, you really want to spend some time to rename each part, because when it comes to rigging later on, you're really going to be happy that you did so. It's also a good idea to keep maybe a copy of this like leg in the scene and then disable the visibility, and then this way you've got a leg in this upright orientation to a weld space, which is more ideal for modeling should you need to go back and change anything or add anything to this. It's much easier to work on this fixed straight orientation than a posed leg. Delete any unnecessary polygons. Then we have ourselves a leg. Now I'm using the axis center in a minute to get the pivot to be at the very top of the object. Now the axis center in itself needs its own tutorial, and there's some really good ones on the YouTube, but I'm going to use this option here to go to the selected point. So I'm going to make sure that I've got the point selected where I want it to be on the object itself, and then I'm going to change this center to be to selected points, and then it will go there at the top there. Normally if you put the y-axis to 100% at the top, say 100% to the right, it will go at the top, and a negative 100% will go to the bottom of the object. This enables me to pivot from this point for rotation and things like that. Once I'm happy with the placement of these parts, I can then move on to the next stage. But for now, I'm just going to get these very simple basic objects all put into their relative position so that the leg is going to be ready to use and place as a whole leg. Alt and G will create a null with the selected objects in it. I'm doing this just temporarily, just to organize things for myself. So this is going to be the lower leg, and then we can select the other parts to the upper leg and do the same thing. Just checking all around. It's a good idea to really check your work as you go along. If there's any errors, then you can go and deal with them right there and then, knowing you're moving on to the next stage, that everything else is done prior to it. So shift selecting all of these, Alt and G to put them in a null, which is pretty much like a folder. And then I'm going to put both of those leg parts into one single null as a single object. Now using this axis tool here, you can manually move the pivot point. Being that I've already gone to the point of deleting the top cap of this, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill that top cap back in so I can use the pole in the center of the top cap as a proper positioning for this, and there's a good reason for this. So that's expand this and select the base. We use a different tool in the modeling room here just so I can show you this. This is going to fill the holes, polygon hole fill in. We can select that polygon that it's made, and then start extruding inwards. Hold the shift key and the point mode to convert that to points, and then of course I've welded it down. A process that I've done a few times now. Now if I use the axis tool on the null itself with the snap turned on, I'm going to be able to snap right to the middle of this. Turn it back off again. You want to make sure you do that. And now we've got a really nice alignment now right at the very top of the base of this leg. Now we're going to use the place tool, and the place tool really does work on the placement of where the pivot point is on the object as well as its up direction. Once you've got those two right, then what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to click on the object you want it to go to just by moving it over the area, and then it will go to the center part of that area against the correct axis of that. Just need to make sure that you've got the orientation correct for this. Once you've done that, then it will work. I found that the reference point having axis turned on is what you need for this. And then we can go ahead and apply it to there. Just got to find that right angle. Then it's going to allow it to fit into that socket at the right angle according to its normal direction. Once you've done this, you can then do exactly the same thing for the others. You need to do one side. Also, if you find that the cavity that you've created on the thorax for the legs to go in isn't quite round, you can just use your brush tool just to sculpt that a bit more rounded to fit the actual base part of the leg. I'm going to select some polygons right in the middle of the area here, and then I'm going to actually change the work plane to match the orientation of that. So you can see here that now the work plane is going to be matching this, so that when we look in a different view, that it's actually going to be facing directly towards us that we're working. In this particular case, it's the top view. And this is going to put me in a much better position then to start to sculpt this area. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be expanding the selection U and Y, and then I'm going to use these sculpting tools just to make it a little bit more round and fit to the orientation or the circle of the joint for the leg. By making sure that I've got a selection like that, it means that it's only going to be manipulating the selection that I've got selected. I'm going to select my brush tool. It's going to be in smear mode, middle mouse button to change the diameter, and you can see here that I'm viewing in the left while I'm manipulating in the right, and then that's how we get that looking a little bit more better for that. Then we just need to do the same process to position all the other legs and scale them appropriately. Make sure that the alignment of the legs are actually aligned to the orientation that they're going to be bending. So you can see here that I'm just aligning that so it's kind of going to be bending more forwards. The back leg's going to be bending more backwards, and the middle leg's going to be bending more towards the outside. And we're doing all of this on the null that's been set up with the correct pivot point. Continuing with the editing, I'm going to make these legs a little bit more unique to the scale of each leg. Of course, this is a rather simplified version of a real anatomically correct B, but we've used pretty basic tool sets and pretty basic primitive objects to model with. We're keeping this pretty low key for the complexity. Now we're going to backtrack a little bit, and we're going to go back to the head and the body, and we're going to make some further details into the geometry and do some manipulation here and there. One of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to create a socket for the antennae. Just looking at my reference image on my right screen just to choose where it is that I want to do this. And I'm going to select 4 corners, and then I'm going to scale it in, and it's going to create the basis of this circle that I want to create. Again, you should be quite familiar with what I'm doing by now. I'm doing the same process. I'm going to select these polygons. And we're going to work with those polygons. So I've extruded a few times now. Selecting the middle polygon. And then I'm going to start to extrude in. Just after I do a little bit of manipulation with the soft selection. This is just so I can create that curvature there that I kind of lost. Then once I've done that, soft selection goes off, and then we will start to extrude inwards. Then what I can do is I can make a copy of this as a basis for the antennae. It's always a good idea to name as you go along, because your scene is certainly going to get more complex and you're going to get multiple objects, so you really need to keep an eye on that. This is the beginning base of the antennae. I'm just going to simply start extruding from this, and then I'm going to keep this straight. It's going to make it easier for rigging later on, and then of course we can bend it and pose it later on. But for now we want to keep everything as neutral as possible. I'm going to copy one of these parts of the leg and use this as a basis for the antennae. Again, holding down that control key when you're selecting an object and move it. Then I'm going to use the place tool to place that on the end of there so it's facing the right orientation. You could also lock the center point of this object using the snap tools, but I won't be going that far. I'm just going to get it roughly in place in the middle there. Then I'm going to just replicate it, holding down the control key and dragging out after I've done each one. Just want to make sure that I do everything that I need to be done to this single one before I move on. Again, you should be quite familiar with what I'm doing by now. I'm doing the same process. I'm going to select these polygons. Give it a little bit of a bevel there with those polygons. So I've extruded a few times now. To keep on copying these and manipulating them. The middle polygon until we've got enough of these antennae. Then I'm going to start to extrude in. It really is a simple but repetitive process. Just after I do a little bit of manipulation, of course you could just use the cloning tool with the soft selection. Another way that you can do this, create that curvature there. But I'm choosing to do something slightly different just so that I can show you the process. Once I've done that, soft selection goes off, and then we will start to extrude inwards. then what I can do is I can make a copy of this as a basis for the antennae. Same procedure, using that control and drag to make a duplicate, and just keep that going until you've got it long enough. And as I mentioned, the tool of choice for this would be the cloner normally, but I don't mind just doing the manual way sometimes with things. Not really of a big deal. I've added a FFD deformer to it so I can do some deformation to it. Again, really nothing unusual or different to the process I've gone to so far. I don't want too many segments in this because I actually want it to taper off a little bit down towards the end. Good thing about Cinema 4D is you've got multiple ways of doing things. You can use a taper deformer in this particular case, or an FFD if you wanted to create a few more adjustments in between, but it doesn't really matter as long as you're using a method that you're comfortable with and that's effective and as fast as possible. Then I'm going to select both of the FFD and the mesh, right click and select current state to object, and then that will make it as one complete object. Then we can move on to the next stage where I'm going to create some areas that are going to be for some wings. This is going to be like the socket where the wings go into. That's the same as I've been doing so far. You can just select each corner there and just scale it down, and then just do your tweaking from there to get a circular round shape. Select that brush tool. And it's in the nudge mode or smear. This is the smear brush. You can see there I'm just getting it prepared a little bit for the next set of extrusions. Once you've gone through this process enough times, you can pretty much make anything. Do the same for the other side. Then of course we'd have to split the model back in half again to apply symmetry. I'm going to turn it to a smooth brush now. It's the same tool, but we've got different types of brushes. For us to create wings, we're going to again start with a primitive object. And we're going to start with something very simple. In this particular case, it's going to be a plane. We're going to make sure that we've got enough segments in this plane so that we can manipulate into the shape that we want. And then once we've got that shape, then I'm going to extrude the edges to create one continuous loop to finish this process. I'm going to get roughly the length that I want so that I can gauge exactly how many spans that I'm going to put in there. I think that will be a good start point for us. Just need to really gauge how many spans are really needed. This is something that over time you're going to be able to more accurately determine with the experience of 3D modeling. So working from the top view, and then I'm going to use some of the tools that we've already been using. What I'm aiming for is to get the polygons as square as possible or close, and then apply that and then use our brush tool to start manipulating that. I'm going to put it back to a smear brush and start to use this to shape the wing. When I require more geometry, I will use the edge slice tool so that I can continue to get the shape that I want. So I've created a copy just by dragging with the control key held down. Then I'm going to use the access tool to allow me to adjust that pivot. The idea of placing that pivot is so we can rotate it around a particular point. Going to manipulate the smaller wing to be a slightly different shape to give it some more uniqueness to it. Changing it to the smooth brush, I can now equalize these polygons out, which distributes them more to the same similar size. With that edge selected, I'm going to extrude out and then to scale it so there's a more even distribution of a space around the edges. And again, once you use the smooth brush or even the iron brush, it's going to start to smooth these things out. Now we've got a continuous edge loop all the way around the shape. Repeat the same process for the other wing. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time organising the scene a bit more and getting all of these parts that are on the left hand side that are to be duplicated to the other side. In order for the mirror to work first time, in this particular case it was easier to create a brand new null because the null is placed exactly in the centre of weld space, and that is where the main body of the bee is also placed. So selecting the thorax part of the geometry, I'm going to delete half of the model by using the loop selection tool, U and L. Once I've deleted this, then I'm going to put the other half into a subdivisional surface and apply it. And then I'm going to do a little bit of optimization by deleting some edge loops that are not really needed anymore. To do this, I will select the edge tool and I'll just double click on edges that I don't feel need to be there anymore. You have to hold the control key when you hit the delete so that it doesn't delete the polygons, it only deletes the edges that you selected. As you can see, there's some polygons or edges that we just don't need there anymore. Now we're going to apply symmetry and make that editable so that it's one complete object again. It's a good idea to check the center points, and if they're not aligning then you need to make sure that they do align. The way to do this is to select all of the edges through the middle and then scale with the shift key held down. But if it's not aligning with the handles, you need to make sure that those handles are set to align with the normals. Now with the shift key, make sure it goes to 0. Make sure the x-axis is 0 and now apply it in the symmetry and it should be fine. Further manipulation of some parts that I'm not happy with, by using the U and the Y key we can grow that selection and then use our soft selection to do some further manipulation. Just wanted it a little bit more flatter than it was. We now could do the same thing to the head, so we're going to select half of that head, we're going to delete it and then apply symmetry, because as you can see here we've created some extra details on the head, only on one side so far, which is where the antennae go into the socket. Also, I don't really like the poles that are on top of the head, so I'm going to use the polygon pen tool just to bridge this over and then create the needed slices to finish it off, so that we've got a nice quad mesh there. You just need to count how many edges there are needed so that you create the right amount of slices that are needed. Now let's run the head through symmetry, and again, if it's not aligning properly through the middle there, then we just need to straighten that out. We'll scale it with the shift key held down, and then we're all good to go. Now we can relax those polygons on top there. You can see by doing this that we've got that nice curvature back on the back of the head that was missing before. This is a time when I've created that null, because I know it's in the center point in which I'm going to be putting all of the objects that need to be mirrored across. Select the null, and then I can put the null inside a symmetry object, and then it's guaranteed to put it to the right side. And then we can apply that and that's all up to date. And we just need to do the same thing for the legs as well. A little bit more manipulation with the soft selection tool just to re-get that shape that I'm after. And again, I'm not liking the poles that are there, so I'm going to do the same thing as I did to the top of the head. I'm going to be bridging it over with the polygon pen. Then use my loop slice tool afterwards. Now, something that I should have done earlier on, I should have created the sockets for the little tiny gripplers that are at the front where the mouth is. So of course it does mean I'm going to have to go for that process of deleting half of it and putting it through the symmetry process again. If I see anything I don't like, I'm going to go in there and correct it and just tighten things up a little bit where they need to be. I'm going to copy this selection and paste it into a new piece of geometry. I'm going to move it away from the socket so that I can start to create this new piece. Now let's create a little bit of detail in there. This is all very basic polygonal modeling, just preparing the area that you want to extrude, maybe flattening it or maybe changing the shape of it, and then go ahead and start to do the extruding from that point. We apply a subdivisional surface to this, and in order to be able to apply symmetry to the other side, I'm going to just delete half of the head and then go for that process again. Now I'm creating the mouth opening for the tongue to come out of here. Knowing that I'm going to be needing to create a symmetrical object of this claw, I'm going to spend a little bit of time just to reform exactly how bent this is at its initial process, so that it doesn't cross to the other side of the face. The axis center is a set of tools that I use quite regularly from the tool menu. I'm going to align the axis handle to weld space, and then I'm going to zero off the coordinates to 0 on the X, so that the handle is placed in the 0 position on the X-axis. This sets it up nicely for applying a symmetrical object to the scene. And let's rename this object. I wouldn't normally typically create any thickness to something like this, but I'm going to try it in this particular case, and of course it means I can show you how to do this with the extrude tool. We need to make sure that the caps are turned on so that we've got double-sided geometry. The reason why I'm doing it in this particular case is because I want to create a bit of thickness at the origin where it goes into the socket, so that I can create a little ball and socket. It's going to be making it a little bit more realistic, the way that it sits in there and rotates in there. I'm going to apply the subdivisional surface at level 1. Now I'm going to start working on creating an area that can fit into the ball and socket where the wings go into the body of the thorax. Again, something that you'll see me quite often do, and that is to prepare the area that I'm about to extrude so that it's got the right shape. So I continue to extrude out to create something that resembles a sphere. And don't worry if it doesn't look like a perfect sphere, because we can use the tools like the iron brush to make it much more like a sphere. All you need to do is just make it a little bit bigger than you need it, so that when the smoothness is applied, it brings it down to the initial size that you actually wanted in the first place. I'm not going to subdivide the entire object again, so I'm using the knife tool to make some additional polygons. I'm going all the way around creating quads. It doesn't matter if you do have the odd triangle here and there, but I'll show you ways in which you can actually get rid of that triangle. And this is when I'm going to create the final slices, and then when those triangles are completed and finished, I'm going to bridge them over with a slice between them, and it will conform that back into a quad again. And this is how we do it. We will dissolve that, and that will create a quad there. Now we just need to smooth all this out. Select it, U and Y to expand that selection. Deselect what we don't want to smooth down, and then use the iron tool. You can see how much better it looks now. Now let's make sure we can fit it into the socket. I just thought it's easier to delete the other wing, duplicate that wing, and then just reshape that wing. Now let's go for the process of adding this to a symmetry object so that it's applied both sides of the bee. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time cleaning up the scene so it makes sense to us. Have some order in there, delete some things we don't need, and rename things that have no name. It's very easy for things to get out of control if you don't rename things, and it will be very difficult when it comes to going through the rigging process, because you really do want to be able to identify what it is that what joint through the rigging process is assigned to what part of your mesh. More so in this particular case where we've got multiple parts to make up a leg, as an example. At some point you will need to go to the mesh, remove and optimize so that you can remove any polygons that are no longer needed. You will also want to run the mesh checker to check for any bad polygons, and then sort them out before you go any further in the process. As you can see here, I've got quite a few bad polygons, and I have no idea how they were created, but if I never have done this mesh check-in, then I would have never have known. UV mapping is a process in which we create a custom map for our 3D object by using specialized tools to create a flat-packed 2D version of that model. This map is recognized by all software that has texturing and baking capabilities designed for this purpose. Learning how to UV map is a skill in and of itself, and it requires a lot of practice and patience. The main thing to understand is we need to create seams where we can cut to unwrap the model, much like unwrapping an orange peel. The seams should be placed ideally in a hidden place, as this can interrupt how the texture maps appear on the surface. We also need to make sure that there is a minimal amount of distortion to the map, so that the map is a true representation of the model in its 3D state. So here's the final model. I've modelled it, I've checked it, I've optimised it, I've made sure the seam's nice and clean, and now I can take it to the next stage, which is to rig it. I've obviously applied some UVs, but this is not something that you have to do unless you're going to be going through the texturing process yourself. But for me, because it's going to be a finished asset, I'm going to make sure that I go for the entire process.